Chapter 6, Omega-3 as resolution substrate. Omega-3 becomes most biologically meaningful when it is understood not as a generic anti-inflammatory nutrient, but as substrate for the completion phase of inflammation. That distinction matters because it changes the entire frame. Anti-inflammatory is often used to imply suppression, as though the goal were simply to turn down symptoms, dampen immune activity, or block the body from expressing force. Resolution is different. Resolution is not the absence of inflammation, and it is not passive fading. It is an active, energy-dependent, signal-dependent sequence in which the body stops unnecessary recruitment, clears inflammatory debris, removes dead cells, restores barrier integrity, reduces pain sensitization, reorganizes vascular behavior, and returns tissue to a state that can support ordinary function again. Omega-3 matters here because EPA and DHA are part of the substrate pool from which the body can generate mediator families involved in that transition. They do not merely calm tissue in the abstract. They help provide the molecular material through which tissue can move from escalation toward completion. This makes Omega-3 fundamentally different from the way it is usually marketed. Most public discussion treats it as a beneficial input that reduces inflammation, supports the brain, helps the heart, or improves general wellness. Those claims are not entirely wrong, but they stay too close to the symptom layer. The deeper reason Omega-3 matters is that it changes what kind of membrane and what kind of signaling reservoir the body is building over time. EPA and DHA enter phospholipids. Once incorporated, they alter membrane behavior, change local lipid organization, and become available for later release when tissues are activated. When the body needs to transition out of acute inflammatory intensity, those stored omega-3 substrates can be enzymatically converted into mediator families that do not simply blunt force, but help redirect the sequence. The body begins reducing neutrophil recruitment, increasing erythrocytosis, improving clearance efficiency, and restoring tissue order. Omega-3 is therefore not just helpful because it makes inflammation smaller. It is helpful because it makes inflammatory sequencing more complete. That idea only becomes clear once inflammation is seen as a timed event rather than as a quantity problem. If inflammation were simply too much immune activity, then suppression would look like the obvious solution. But much of chronic inflammatory illness is not caused by the mere existence of inflammatory force. It is caused by incomplete inflammatory sequencing. The body still initiates. It still recruits. It still produces pain sensitization, vascular change, and immune traffic. What it does poorly is exit. Tissue remains open, noisy, metabolically expensive, and structurally unresolved. In that setting, Omega-3 becomes important because it contributes to the substrate environment required for tissues to stop living in early-phase chemistry. It gives the body a way to generate different downstream instructions from the same activated membrane environment. The tissue does not just stop. It begins doing different work. EPA and DHA are not identical in this regard, and their distinction matters. EPA can enter eicosanoid pathways and alter the mediator profile generated during inflammatory activation. In some cases, it produces related mediator families with different biological intensity or different downstream implications than arachidonic acid-derived products. EPA also serves as substrate for E-series resolvins, which participate in the later phases of inflammatory control. DHA contributes strongly to membrane structure in specialized tissues, especially neural and retinal tissues, but it is also a major substrate for D-series resolvins, protectins, and marazins. These mediator families are not simply weaker inflammatory signals. They carry a different kind of instruction. They help limit further neutrophil influx, promote macrophage-driven clearance of dead cells and debris, reduce unnecessary tissue injury, and improve the transition from defense to repair. This is why the term resolution substrate is more accurate than anti-inflammatory fat. Omega-3 is not just turning inflammatory volume down, it is helping write the exit sequence. This has major consequences for how chronic disease should be understood. A tissue with low omega-3 incorporation and poor access to resolution-mediating substrate may still initiate inflammation very effectively. In fact, many chronically ill tissues do exactly that. They are good at escalation. They are chemically prepared to recruit, amplify, and sensitize. But when acute work should begin handing off to cleanup and restoration, the signaling environment is weaker, the membrane reservoir is biased toward early-phase chemistry, and the body has fewer tools available to terminate the sequence intelligently. The result is persistence. The tissue continues behaving as though the emergency is still unfolding because it has not been given the molecular instruction set required to complete what it started. Omega-3 matters because it helps restore part of that missing instruction set, but only if it is actually incorporated into the tissue and only if the surrounding architecture can protect and use it. That last condition is essential because omega-3 is not magic. EPA and DHA are highly unsaturated molecules, and that unsaturation gives them flexibility and signaling value, but it also makes them chemically fragile. A body under high oxidative stress, poor antioxidant protection, chronic membrane damage, or heavy inflammatory load may incorporate omega-3 into an environment that cannot yet protect it well. In that case, the person may not experience the full benefit expected from simple supplementation. Some may feel only modest changes. Some may feel unstable responses. Some may improve only after broader structural conditions begin to change. This is one reason fish oil discussions have become so confused. People expect omega-3 to behave like a pharmacologic override, when in reality, it behaves more like structural preparation for a different signaling outcome. Resolution substrate only matters if the tissue can hold it, preserve it, release it properly, and move through the downstream sequence it supports. This also explains why omega-3 belongs inside the membrane story rather than floating above it as a separate nutrient topic. Resolution does not begin with a capsule. It begins with tissue remodeling. EPA and DHA have to enter phospholipids, influence local membrane conditions, compete within the substrate environment, and become part of the body's stored response potential. That takes time. It depends on turnover. It depends on transport. It depends on the larger lipid environment, including what kinds of omega-6 derived substrates dominate the membrane, what oxidative pressure the tissue is under, how well mitochondria can support the energy cost of repair, and whether barrier systems are still feeding repeated activation into the same tissue. Omega-3 works inside architecture, is not outside architecture. That is why the benefits of omega-3 often appear inconsistent when the architecture surrounding it is ignored. The phrase resolution substrate also makes clear that omega-3 does not eliminate the need for initiation. The body still requires omega-6 derived activation chemistry. It still needs arachidonic acid to generate early inflammatory force when injury, infection, or real tissue disruption occurs. Omega-3 does not replace that need. It complements it by helping the body avoid permanent residence in that early phase. A healthy organism requires both entry into defense and exit from defense. Omega-6 helps heavily with the first. Omega-3 helps heavily with the second. That is why the relationship matters more than the slogan. The body is not healthiest when it suppresses all initiation. It is healthiest when it can initiate proportionately and then resolve completely. Omega-3 earns its place not because it opposes inflammation as such, but because it helps protect the body from becoming trapped in inflammation after the necessary phase has passed. Once this is seen clearly, many familiar contradictions start to resolve. A person can have inflammatory symptoms despite taking omega-3 because substrate incorporation alone does not guarantee full resolution if the tissue remains barrier disrupted, oxidatively unstable, or repeatedly retriggered. Another person may improve substantially because their tissues were able to remodel, protect, and use the new substrate environment effectively. A third person may notice neurological or mood-related improvement because DHA-dependent membrane behavior in neural tissue shifted before obvious systemic inflammatory markers changed. These are not random outcomes. They reflect the fact that omega-3 is acting as part of tissue architecture and downstream mediator availability, not merely as a universal symptom-lowering chemical. The central point of this chapter is that omega-3 should be understood as material for inflammatory completion. EPA and DHA are built into membranes, stored in tissues, and later converted into mediator families that help the body shift out of escalation and into cleanup, repair, and restored control. That makes omega-3 biologically decisive, but only within a larger structural logic. Resolution requires substrate, but it also requires energy, timing, immune phenotype change, barrier repair, and a membrane environment that can support the sequence without falling back into repeated initiation. Omega-3 is one of the body's major resources for that work. It does not force resolution from the outside. It equips the body to generate resolution from within. EPA and DHA as precursors, not endpoints. EPA and DHA are often discussed as though their biological importance ends once they are present in the blood, the capsule, or even the membrane. That framing is incomplete. EPA and DHA matter precisely because they are not endpoints. They are precursors. They are upstream material that the body can incorporate, store, release, and convert into later functions depending on tissue state and inflammatory timing. Their presence alone does not equal resolution. Their intake alone does not equal repair. Even their incorporation into phospholipids is still only part of the story. What makes them decisive is what the body is then able to do with them. They become part of membrane architecture, yes, but they also become part of future signaling possibility. They are reserve material for downstream mediator production, reserve material for altered receptor environments, reserve material for a different inflammatory sequence than the one dominated by repeated omega-6 initiation. This matters because modern supplement language tends to treat EPA and DHA as finished therapeutic agents. One hears that EPA lowers inflammation, DHA supports the brain, and the implication is that once these molecules are consumed, the work is largely done. But biology does not work that way. A molecule can be present and still remain underused, misused, oxidized, poorly incorporated, or functionally muted by the surrounding architecture. EPA and DHA have to enter the body, survive digestion, be absorbed, be transported, be incorporated into the right phospholipid pools, and then be retained in tissues long enough to alter membrane behavior and future signaling output. Even after that, their deepest effects still remain conditional. A tissue under inflammatory challenge must be able to release them at the right time, route them into the right enzymatic pathways, and convert them into mediator families that help redirect the sequence toward completion. EPA and DHA are therefore potential, not guarantee. They are substrate, not finished result. EPA shows this especially clearly because much of its importance lies in what it can become under activated conditions. Once incorporated into membranes, EPA can compete within eicosanoid pathways and shift the character of the lipid mediators generated when phospholipids release fatty acids from phospholipids. It can also serve as precursor for E-series resolvins, which help reduce unnecessary neutrophil trafficking, improve clearance behavior, and move tissues away from repeated escalation. That means EPA is valuable not simply because it exists in the membrane, but because it changes the options available once the membrane is mobilized. It alters the future chemistry of inflammation. Its role is therefore prospective. The body stores EPA now so that later, under conditions of activation, different instructions can be generated from a same surface. DHA is similar, but its role carries an even stronger structural component in certain tissues. DHA is heavily incorporated into neural and retinal membranes, where its effects on curvature behavior, receptor environment, excitability, and membrane dynamics are especially important. But even here, DHA is not the endpoint. It is precursor to additional levels of function. Once released from membranes under the right conditions, DHA can be converted into D-series resolvins, protectins, and marazins, mediator families associated with inflammatory resolution, tissue protection, phagocytic efficiency, and restoration of tissue order. In other words, DHA does not only help build a different membrane, it helps build a membrane capable of supplying a different downstream language during stress and repair. Its importance lies not just in what it is, but in what it enables. This distinction between precursor and endpoint also explains why omega-3 results are often delayed, inconsistent, or context-dependent. If EPA and DHA were endpoints, their presence alone should generate uniform outcomes. But they are not endpoints. They are integrated into systems that have to process them correctly. A person may consume omega-3 yet remain in a tissue environment dominated by repeated oxidative injury, ongoing barrier dysfunction, excessive arachidonic acid-driven initiation, poor mitochondrial support, or weak enzymatic conversion into pro-resolving mediators. In that setting, EPA and DHA can still be biologically valuable, but their value may not be fully expressed because the sequence they are meant to support keeps getting interrupted. The substrate is present, but the downstream machinery is not yet coordinating around it. This is why omega-3 cannot be judged only by intake or blood level. The real question is whether the body is using EPA and DHA as precursors to a different kind of tissue behavior. Thinking of EPA and DHA as precursors also keeps the timing of physiology clear. They do not act like fast-acting suppressive drugs. They act more like strategic construction material that changes future response capacity. First, they alter membrane composition. Then, that new composition changes receptor environment, substrate balance, and membrane behavior. Later, under activation, it changes what kinds of mediators can be generated and in what proportion. Later still, those mediators influence immune cell trafficking, debris clearance, vascular normalization, pain desensitization, and barrier recovery. This is a long chain. It begins with intake, but it does not end there. The endpoint is not EPA or DHA sitting in tissue. The endpoint is improved sequence, better transition from initiation to resolution, better cleanup, better recovery, better return to baseline. This is one reason the language around omega-3 has to become more exact. When people say omega-3 is anti-inflammatory, they often imagine the molecule itself as the final actor. In reality, EPA and DHA are more like upstream raw material for a body trying to become better at its own later stage work. They are part of the preconditions for resolution. They help create a membrane environment that can behave differently, and they help supply the fatty acid substrate from which later pro-resolving mediators can be generated. That is a more powerful role than the usual supplement narrative allows, but is also a more conditional one. A precursor is only as useful as the system that converts it into action. This brings the structural logic of the book back into focus. The body does not heal by possessing the right molecules in abstraction. It heals by building them into the right places, releasing them under the right conditions, and converting them into the right outputs at the right phase of a biological sequence. EPA and DHA belong to that logic. They are not endpoints because biology rarely ends at the molecule. Biology moves through architecture, activation, conversion, and consequence. EPA and DHA matter because they sit near the beginning of that chain. They are part of what the body must have on hand before it can resolve intelligently later. Seen clearly, this makes omega-3 more important and less magical at the same time. More important because EPA and DHA are upstream determinants of what kinds of inflammatory and reparative chemistry become possible. Less magical because they do not bypass structure, oxidation, transport, membrane remodeling, immune phenotype shifts, or the energy cost of repair. They are not the finished answer. They are the starting material for a better answer. The body requires them not because they are the final form of health, but because without them, one of the major biochemical roads toward completion remains underbuilt from the start. The limitation of anti-inflammatory thinking. The phrase anti-inflammatory sounds useful because it appears to offer a clear goal. Inflammation is associated with pain, swelling, fatigue, tissue irritation, vascular dysfunction, and many chronic disease states, so anything described as anti-inflammatory is assumed to be beneficial almost by definition. But that language creates a major conceptual error. It treats inflammation as though the main problem were simply excess quantity, as though the body were generating too much force, and the solution were therefore to reduce that force as directly as possible. In many real biological situations, that is not the deepest problem. The deeper problem is failed sequencing. The body is often able to initiate inflammation quite effectively. What it does poorly is complete the process and restore tissue order once the useful phase has ended. Anti-inflammatory thinking reduces this entire sequence to a volume knob. Resolution biology shows that the real issue is often not volume, but timing, direction, and exit. This matters because inflammation is not inherently pathological. Acute inflammation is one of the main ways the body protects itself. It increases vascular access, recruits immune cells, changes pain thresholds, mobilizes local defenses, and creates the conditions needed to contain damage or infection. A body incapable of mounting inflammation would not become healthier. It would become vulnerable, slow, and unable to protect its own structure under stress. The anti-inflammatory frame often forgets this and encourages people to think that less inflammatory activity is always better. That is not true. The body does not need less inflammation in the abstract. It needs the right inflammation at the right time for the right duration, followed by the right transition into clearance, repair, and normalization. Once that is understood, the inadequacy of anti-inflammatory thinking becomes obvious. It aims at suppression when the body often requires orchestration. The problem becomes especially clear in chronic illness. Many chronic inflammatory states are not driven by a simple surplus of inflammatory ability. They are driven by tissues that remain trapped in early-phase inflammatory logic. The body keeps recruiting, sensitizing, leaking, signaling, and amplifying because the later phases that should terminate the response have not gained control. Debris remains uncleared. Barrier function remains weak. Macrophages do not transition efficiently into restorative behavior. Pro-resolving mediator production remains inadequate relative to the scale of initiation. Oxidative stress continues damaging membranes, which then continue releasing more substrate for early-phase chemistry. In that setting, calling the problem inflammation and looking for an anti-inflammatory solution misses the central failure. The system is not merely too active. It is unfinished. This is one reason blunt suppression often produces incomplete results. If a person lowers one branch of inflammatory output but does nothing to restore membrane composition, improve barrier integrity, reduce repeated triggers, support mitochondrial stability, or supply substrate for resolution-mediating pathways, then the visible intensity of inflammation may drop while the underlying tissue state remains unresolved. Symptoms quiet temporarily, but the system remains easy to reignite because the architecture of overinitiation has not changed. The body is still loaded with activation substrate, still structurally unstable, still poor at clearance, and still unable to complete the sequence that suppression interrupted rather than finished. This is not an argument against symptom relief. It is an argument against mistaking symptom reduction for biological completion. The language of anti-inflammatory also flattens the role of omega-3 into something smaller than it actually is. EPA and DHA are often described as anti-inflammatory fats, which makes them sound like biological dampers whose main value lies in turning inflammatory chemistry down. That description misses the deeper reason they matter. Omega-3 functions as resolution substrate. It changes membrane composition, alters the pool of releasable fatty acids during activation, and provides precursor material for mediator families that help reduce neutrophil recruitment, improve erythrocytosis, limit collateral injury, and restore tissue order. These are not simply weaker inflammatory signals. They are part of a different phase of a sequence. Anti-inflammatory language makes omega-3 sound suppressive when in reality its most important role is often transitional. It helps the body move from defense toward completion. There is also a practical limitation built into anti-inflammatory thinking because it encourages people to judge success too early and too narrowly. If the goal is only to lower inflammatory markers or reduce discomfort, then any intervention that decreases visible output may appear successful even if the tissue remains metabolically expensive, structurally fragile, and dependent on ongoing suppression. A more serious biological standard asks a different set of questions. Has neutrophil recruitment decreased because the problem resolved, or because signaling was blocked while debris remained? Has pain decreased because tissue normalized, or because sensitization was muted while the underlying trigger persisted? Has cytokine output fallen because inflammatory sequencing completed, or because the immune system was restrained without barrier repair and cleanup? Anti-inflammatory thinking does not force these distinctions. Resolution thinking does. This is why the body should be understood as needing inflammatory competence plus resolution competence, not simply lower inflammatory tone. It must be able to mount force when force is necessary. It must also be able to withdraw that force without leaving behind damaged tissue, trapped immune cells, oxidized membranes, persistent nociceptive signaling, or open vascular and epithelial barriers. The healthier body is not the body that never inflames. It is the body that inflames proportionately, clears efficiently, and exits cleanly. Once this becomes the frame, many familiar contradictions disappear. It becomes easier to understand why chronic disease can coexist with immune activation and poor healing at the same time, why symptom suppression can fail to restore baseline, and why omega-3 matters more as a precursor to completion than as a generic anti-inflammatory badge. The limitation of anti-inflammatory thinking, then, is that it mistakes a phase for the whole process and a symptom strategy for a system strategy. It is built around the assumption that inflammation is the enemy rather than recognizing that unfinished inflammation is the enemy. The real problem in many chronic conditions is not that the body can still generate force, it is that it has become less able to close the loop once force has been used. A more accurate framework is therefore not anti-inflammatory but pro-resolution, structure-aware, and sequence-aware. That framework does not ask only how to make inflammation smaller. It asks how to make the body better at finishing what it starts so tissue can return to order instead of remaining suspended in defense. The requirement for downstream conversion. EPA and DHA do not resolve inflammation simply by being present. They have to be converted downstream into usable biological action, and that requirement is one of the main reasons omega-3 is so often misunderstood. Intake is upstream. Tissue incorporation is upstream. Even membrane enrichment is still upstream. The body only benefits fully when those stored omega-3 molecules are taken from structural presence into functional sequence. That means release from phospholipids at the right time, enzymatic handling through the right pathways, generation of mediator families capable of changing inflammatory behavior, and successful execution of the processes those mediators are meant to direct. Without downstream conversion, omega-3 remains potential sitting in tissue. It may still influence membrane properties to some extent, but its most important role in resolution biology remains underexpressed. This is why the presence of substrate should never be confused with completion of the pathway that substrate is meant to support. The body treats EPA and DHA as raw material for later instruction. Once inflammatory activation has already begun, those fatty acids have to be liberated from membrane phospholipids and then routed into the enzymatic systems that can generate resolvins, protectins, marazins, and related mediator classes. That step is not automatic in the simplistic sense. It depends on timing, tissue state, enzyme availability, redox environment, the local presence of competing substrates such as arachidonic acid, and the broader structural condition of the tissue undergoing inflammation. A body can contain EPA and DHA, yet still fail to convert enough of them into meaningful pro-resolving output if the inflammatory environment remains dominated by initiation chemistry, if oxidative damage is distorting enzymatic behavior, or if the tissue is repeatedly re-triggered before the later phases of the sequence can establish control. In practical terms, this means omega-3 status alone cannot tell the whole story. The real question is whether the tissue can use omega-3 as precursor rather than merely store it as decoration. This requirement for conversion is one of the main differences between structural presence and signaling consequence. A phospholipid containing DHA in a neural membrane may already alter curvature behavior, receptor environment, and excitability even before any enzymatic release occurs. That is real and important. But the deeper resolution role of DHA only appears when the body is able to transform that substrate into the downstream mediator language required for inflammatory completion and tissue protection. The same applies to EPA. Its incorporation can alter membrane behavior and substrate competition, but its most decisive role in resolution depends on what happens after activation. The body must turn stored omega-3 into instruction. If it cannot, then inflammation may continue to begin with force while the exit chemistry remains too weak to take command. This is one reason the benefits of omega-3 often appear incomplete in chronically stressed or metabolically unstable tissue. The substrate entered the system, but the sequence that should follow it remained underbuilt. Downstream conversion also makes clear that resolution is an active process, not a passive decline in inflammatory noise. Pro-resolving mediators do not simply allow inflammation to fade from lack of stimulation. They help direct specific forms of work. They reduce further neutrophil recruitment. They encourage macrophages to engulf apoptotic cells and debris more efficiently. They help limit unnecessary tissue damage. They support restoration of barrier integrity, normalization of vascular behavior, and the withdrawal of alarm signaling once the relevant task has been completed. All of that requires actual biochemical instruction. The body does not drift into order by accident. It has to be told through the right mediator environment that the emergency phase is over and that cleanup and rebuilding now have priority. EPA and DHA matter because they help supply that later instruction, but only if the body completes the conversion from precursor to mediator. This is why simply labeling omega-3 as anti-inflammatory creates confusion. That phrase makes it sound as though EPA and DHA should directly suppress inflammatory output by their mere presence, and when that does not happen uniformly, people assume the concept itself is weak or overstated. In reality, the issue is often that the body has not completed the necessary downstream work. A person may increase omega-3 intake, but if membrane incorporation remains limited, if the inflammatory environment remains saturated with repeated omega-6 driven initiation, if oxidative stress keeps damaging membranes faster than they can be remodeled, or if immune cells do not transition efficiently into pro-resolving phenotypes, then conversion into meaningful resolution output may remain poor. The intervention then appears weaker than expected, not because omega-3 lacks importance, but because precursor alone does not replace pathway competence. Competition also matters here. EPA and DHA do not enter an empty enzymatic landscape. They enter tissues where arachidonic acid oxidative stress, cytokine signaling, phospholipase activity, and multiple enzyme systems are already shaping what kinds of mediators are most likely to be produced. If the membrane substrate pool remains heavily weighted toward initiation chemistry, the body may continue defaulting toward early-phase eicosanoid production even while omega-3 is present in meaningful amounts. The issue is not simple exclusion, is proportion and pathway priority. A tissue repeatedly mobilized into early inflammatory behavior will keep behaving according to the substrate and enzymatic dominance built into that state. For omega-3 to express its full resolution value, the system has to shift far enough that downstream conversion into pro-resolving mediator classes can actually influence the sequence rather than remain biochemically possible but biologically minor. The requirement for downstream conversion also explains why time matters so much in omega-3 biology. Structural remodeling takes time. But beyond remodeling, tissues also need time to enter inflammatory events with a different substrate environment and to allow that environment to generate different downstream consequences. This is slower than a drug effect because it is not a direct override. It is a change in how the body is prepared to respond the next time activation occurs. First, the membrane changes. Then the substrate reservoir changes. Then, under future challenge, the mediator output can begin changing. Then immune behavior, clearance, pain signaling, and tissue restoration can begin shifting. The real endpoint is not higher intake or even higher membrane incorporation. The real endpoint is a different inflammatory trajectory once the body is stressed again. Seen clearly, downstream conversion is the step that separates nutritional presence from physiological consequence. EPA and DHA are necessary because they provide raw material the body cannot easily replace from nothing, but their necessity is only fully expressed when that material is transformed into action. The body needs more than omega-3 stored in tissue. It needs omega-3 released, enzymatically processed, translated into pro-resolving mediator families, and then followed by the actual cellular work of clearance, restraint, repair, and return to baseline. That is why omega-3 should never be understood as a finished answer. It is upstream material for a sequence the body still has to know how to run. When that sequence is intact, omega-3 becomes one of the most important resources for inflammatory completion. When that sequence is impaired, omega-3 may still help structurally, but its deepest value remains only partially expressed because the body is holding the precursor without fully converting it into resolution. Setting the stage for resolution. Resolution does not begin at the moment the body decides to stop inflammation. It begins earlier in the way tissue is built, the way activation is sequenced, and the way damage is handled while the inflammatory response is still underway. This is one of the biggest reasons resolution is so often misunderstood. People imagine it as a passive settling phase that follows once the provoking stimulus fades or once enough inflammatory force has been blocked. Real biology is more demanding than that. A tissue can only resolve well if it has preserved enough structural order during activation to support the transition out of activation. It has to retain membrane integrity, enough energetic capacity to carry out cleanup, enough vascular control to stop oversupplying the inflammatory zone, enough immune precision to shift from recruitment into clearance, and enough stored substrate to produce the mediator language that tells the system the early phase is over. Resolution is therefore not an afterthought added to inflammation. Is the later half of the same sequence, and its success depends on what conditions were preserved or lost during the beginning. This means the stage for resolution is set first in membranes. The membrane determines which substrates are available once phospholipases are activated, which receptors amplify early-phase chemistry, how much oxidative fragility the tissue carries into stress, and whether the cell has access to omega-3, derived precursors that can later be converted into pro-resolving mediators. A membrane overloaded with activation-heavy substrate, structurally unstable under oxidative strain, or chronically remodeled by repeated inflammatory cycles, does not enter tissue stress neutrally. It enters already biased toward escalation. That bias matters because the same membrane that releases arachidonic acid during initiation must later provide EPA and DHA if the tissue is going to shift toward completion. The membrane is therefore not only the place where inflammation starts, is the place where the possibility of ending inflammation is either preserved or weakened before the event has fully unfolded. The stage is also set by whether the tissue can contain damage without turning every local signal into a system-wide problem. Barrier integrity matters here in a very literal sense. If intestinal barriers remain permeable, microbial fragments and incompletely excluded materials continue feeding immune provocation into the organism. If endothelial barriers remain overly permissive, immune traffic, plasma proteins, and inflammatory signals keep entering tissue spaces that should already be returning to tighter control. If cellular membranes remain oxidatively unstable, danger chemistry continues leaking out of damaged compartments and telling surrounding cells that disruption is still active. Resolution requires that inputs sustaining initiation begin to fall. That only happens when boundaries start holding again. A body cannot exit inflammation cleanly while still receiving repeated evidence, real or perceived, that the problem is ongoing. Immune cell behavior is another major part of this preparation. Early in inflammation, neutrophils and related acute responders are necessary because speed matters. But resolution cannot occur if the tissue stays dominated by recruitment logic. Macrophages have to shift from aggressive inflammatory participation toward efferocytosis, debris handling, and orchestration of repair. That transition is not cosmetic. It changes the tissue from a site of attack into a site of controlled dismantling and reconstruction. Dead cells must be recognized and removed without spilling their contents further into the environment. Extracellular debris has to be cleared before it becomes a new inflammatory trigger. Local cytokine tone has to change. Lipid mediator output has to change. This is one reason the body needs omega-3, derived downstream conversion. Without the mediator environment that supports this handoff, immune activity often remains stuck in the earlier logic of arrival and force rather than moving into containment and cleanup. Energy availability also determines whether resolution can happen at all. Cleanup is expensive. Membrane repair is expensive. Rebuilding junctions, reorganizing tissue architecture, restoring ion gradients, recycling damaged components, and supporting phenotype shifts in immune cells all require functioning mitochondrial output. A body already living near its energetic limit may still initiate inflammation because initiation can be driven by stress chemistry and stored substrate release, but it may fail when the time comes to pay for completion. This creates one of the hidden asymmetries of chronic inflammation. The organism still has enough force to begin, but not enough organized energy to finish. Resolution, therefore, depends not only on having the right signals, but on having enough mitochondrial integrity and metabolic stability to carry out the labor those signals demand. Timing is part of the stage as well. Resolution is not supposed to begin before initiation has done its necessary work, but it is also not supposed to wait indefinitely. The system has to know when enough recruitment has occurred, when the threat is controlled enough, when collateral damage is beginning to outweigh benefit, and when the tissue must change priorities from force to restoration. That timing is created through mediator shifts, receptor signaling shifts, immune cell phenotype shifts, substrate availability, and local tissue feedback. A body trapped in over-initiation loses this timing. It keeps treating the tissue as though more recruitment is still the answer. Setting the stage for resolution, therefore, means preserving the ability to change phases. The tissue must remain capable of hearing a new instruction rather than repeating the old one more loudly. This is where anti-inflammatory thinking fails most clearly. It assumes the solution is to turn inflammatory intensity down, when in reality the body needs conditions that allow phase transition. Lowering output without improving membrane-substrate balance, barrier repair, immune cleanup behavior, mitochondrial capacity, and downstream omega-3 conversion may reduce visible inflammation while leaving the tissue unable to truly resolve. The stage has not been set. The actors have only been quieted. Real resolution requires a tissue environment that can stop recruiting, start clearing, and then rebuild in a way that reduces the likelihood of immediate reactivation. That is a much deeper biological achievement than symptom suppression, and it depends on structure as much as it depends on signaling. Seen clearly, setting the stage for resolution means preparing the body to finish what inflammation begins. It means membranes that carry not only activation substrate, but completion substrate. It means barriers that can close again after they open. It means immune cells that can shift from combat to cleanup. It means mitochondria that can fund repair after stress. It means tissue architecture stable enough to survive the inflammatory phase without collapsing into ongoing danger signaling. Resolution is not an accidental fade-out at the end of inflammation. It is a built capacity, and like every other meaningful capacity in physiology, it has to be prepared in advance.